So I just want to welcome everyone to the Natural Areas Association 2023 webinar series. My name is Maura McGinty-Kloss, and I am the Director of Programs and Communications. And thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate that you're here. The purpose of NAA webinars is not just to convey information, but to engage natural areas professionals on topics of interest that highlight emerging science, methodologies, and best practices. We encourage you to participate in this webinar by posting comments and questions. Comments in the chat function and questions in the Q&A function, and we'll be answering as many of these as possible. If there is a topic of interest for a future webinar, please don't hesitate to let us know by emailing info@naturalareas.org. So I just want to take a minute to tell you about the Natural Areas Association. We're a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. And NAA provides applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge transfer related to the management of natural areas. We share a suite of programs designed to achieve on-the-ground outcomes and to encourage practitioner participation and engagement, particularly with one another. So if you want to learn more about NAA's upcoming programs, you can just use the QR code. It'll take you to our website. But before we get started, I do want to share two programs that are coming up. These are hot off the press. They're not even on our website yet, but we wanted to share them with this particular audience because we knew they would be of interest to you. So these are in-person workshops. We call them Stewardship in Action Field Workshops. One is going to be in Kansas City, Missouri. It's Urban Treasures, the Restoration and Management of High-Value Remnant Natural Areas. And then the second will be in the Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico, Nature-Based Restoration, a tribe's process-based approach to restore a vital watershed. And these are very limited. They're small by design. And they are an opportunity to convene practitioners, to consider solutions, to share challenges, to learn from each other and from experts. So in addition, they allow us to put a spotlight, highlighting a region, an ecosystem, a methodology, or a collaborative approach, or something that is unique that can be emulated by others. So there's a lot of engagement, a lot of learning from each other. These programs are kept very small by design for that level of engagement, so they do fill up quickly. So that's why I wanted to let you know about them so that you can maybe mark your calendars. Please know that both of these programs will include utilization of native plant material and a focus on seed. And now let's go to today's program. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to participate, as I mentioned earlier. If you have comments, questions, or things to share, please post those in chat. If you have a question related to the program, Beth Ledger, one of our speakers, will be monitoring that and will be working to answer those questions. So just so that your question does not get lost in chat, please post it in Q&A. And should you wish to use captions during this program, you can do so by selecting Show Captions located in your Zoom navigation bar. So now I'm going to introduce the first of our two speakers, and they're going to be working together, so I will introduce both of them up front. So Dr. Susan P. Harrison is a distinguished professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy of the University of California, Davis. She was elected into the National Academy of Sciences in 2018 for her work in environmental science and ecology. Dr. Harrison is a leader in the study of ecological diversity at different spatial and temporal scales and of the mechanisms and processes that maintain diversity. Her work is of fundamental importance for the understanding of the impact of global change on ecological communities and for the conservation biology from local to global scales. She received her BS in 1983 in zoology, an MS in 1986 in ecology from the University of California, Davis, and her PhD in biology from Stanford University. And Dr. Elizabeth Ledger, also known as Beth, is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she is a faculty member since 2006. She got her PhD in plant ecology from UC Davis and did a postdoc focused on the invasive plants at SUNY Stony Brook. Her current research focuses on native plant ecology and restoration in invaded areas of the Great Basin. She serves the greater scientific community with review and editorial work and has served on multiple grant review panels for federal organizations, including the USDA and NSF. In addition to her work in plant ecology and restoration, Dr. Ledger is the co-creator and director of the University of Nevada, Reno Museum of Natural History, which is a major research, teaching, and outreach institution at UNR. And I know she also provides great support to many, many students. So with that, I am now going to turn it over to our speakers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Maura, for that introduction and also for the invitation. And thanks also to the NAA for inviting us. We, the National Academies Committee who wrote this report, are very excited about the report. We're all pretty fanatical about the subject of the native seed supply and eager to share our conclusions and recommendations with you all. And we anticipate that these conclusions and recommendations will be one that you, as conservation, land management, restoration practitioners, will probably generally like, because that was very much the bent of the committee. We want to improve restoration. We want to make recommendations that will improve restoration. And that was very much the guiding spirit behind this project, which started in 2019. On a personal note, I was, excited, but also kind of surprised to be asked to be the chair. Restoration is not central to my research area. It's something I'm tangentially rather than centrally connected to. And so this whole process has been a fabulous learning experience for me. And I've learned from the best in all facets of restoration, especially those related to seeds and their supply. But we worked on this report for a couple of years, 2019 to basically we released the report at the beginning of this year, and the report was commissioned by the BLM because of their longstanding interest in and commitment to improving restoration and improving the seed supply. So they sponsored our study, and you can see here our statement of task, which was basically to assess what we came to call the seed supply chain. And we use seed as shorthand to refer to all native plant materials used in restoration and related activities. So seeds, cuttings, container plants, etc. And we were supposed to kind of assess the current status of the supply chain, recommend ways to improve it and increase it. And the BLM started out with the primary interest in the Western US, but the focus of the report had a kind of a dual nature, kind of focus on the West, but also expand our view to the whole country. And I won't introduce the committee members individually. You can see a list of them here on the right, but a really fantastic group of people with expertise at all levels in this problem, and also including some statistical data analysis experts to help us process our information. And I really want to give a very warm acknowledgement to the National Academy staff led by Robin Shane, the program director, for their expert support that very much made this report possible. So you all know, this is very much preaching to the choir here, that restoration is an ever-growing need on our ever-growing quantities of degraded land in the US and around the world for that matter, for all sorts of reasons, including but not limited to land use, pollution, climate change, etc. And as I'm sure you're also aware, being experts in this area, there is a continuum of approaches that ranges starting at the right-hand end of this figure, from pure restoration or kind of high-level restoration, where the intent is to put back a damaged or degraded natural ecosystem, to some of the activities farther to the left in this figure, sometimes called revegetation, where the intent is to restore specific functions, not necessarily to try to put back the entire ecosystem. And you can go even further left than that on this graph. But where our interest starts is sort of around repairing and initiating. In other words, where seeds have to be added to get ecosystems back again, or at least to get some of their functions back again. We did have this interesting problem of how to deal with a continuum from very practical, utilitarian, not necessarily restoration kinds of interests to pure or kind of higher level restoration interests as we carried out our work. I found this graphic from the Society for Ecological Restoration very helpful in understanding those divergences of interest and opinion that arise from these different facets or different levels of restoration. At any rate, again, preaching to the audience, preaching to the choir, you all know that seeds or plant materials are the foundation of all restoration. You can't have an ecosystem without its plants. And it's been recognized for a long time that seeds are not only a necessity, but probably one of the key limiting resources in terms of enabling people to do as much restoration as they would like to do, or even are mandated to do. And this recognition arose, at one time it arose, that was kind of foundational to our study, was in 2002, when there was actually a congressional mandate to some of the federal land agencies to get their act together and figure out what to do to expand the seed supply. Another step in the process of recognizing and grappling with the need for more seeds was in, I believe, 2015 with the National Seed Strategy. It was released, begun in 2015 and released in 2017, something like that. So again, just this recognition that we can't have restoration until we have the right seed in the right place at the right time, which was one of the catchphrases of the National Seed Strategy. Well, it turns out that our National Academy study is, in fact, the implementation of one of the, I think, 4 recommendations of the National Seed Strategy. So the first recommendation was study the problem with a panel of experts and come up with some conclusions and recommendations. So that's where we fit into this longer history of trying to grapple with the seed supply problem. Why is seed supply a problem? Well, in very brief, it is a problem of time and space. The time that it takes to develop native seed, since native seed tends to be a relatively specialized product, not one that can be just grown en masse and put on the shelves like tomato seeds at Home Depot or something, but rather something that has to be tailored to individual sites. That implies a need to go out and oftentimes collect it from natural locations, bring it into cultivation, grow up 1 or more generations of it, and then clean and store and quality control and store this product until it can be sold or given to the people that are going to use it. And all of this can easily constitute a 2-year cycle, if not more. So that's the problem of time that is a very crucial one for this whole endeavor. And the problem of space that's very much related to this is that ecological restorationists want seeds that are, in quotes, genetically appropriate, a kind of an umbrella term that we use to cover a difficult issue, which is how local does the seed have to be to the site at which it is used to be locally adapted enough to be able to thrive and join and be part of that ecosystem. So we want it to be from the same, quote, seed zone, another jargon term that's used to refer to these geographic areas of local adaptation. And we don't want the seed to have persisted in cultivation for too many generations, even without deliberate selection, because it can lose some of its wild type characters and therefore no longer be locally adapted. So in a nutshell here, we're talking about a very specialized product, not one that it benefits from economies of scale, one that suffers from diseconomies of scale. This very specialized product that takes a lot of expertise to produce and also to store and transport and deploy. It's a form of agriculture that's very much harder than growing a typical crop. And to give you, again, I suppose the metaphor of in a nutshell is a little bit of a double entendre here, but in a nutshell, our findings and conclusions are summarized on the slide. The problem, the biggest aspect of the problem is that buyers, some of whom are from the private sector, many of whom are from the public sector, don't always demand these so-called genetically appropriate native seeds that represent species from their ecosystem of a genotype that is not too far away from the target ecosystem. Even though they may want such seeds, they don't demand them because they're not convinced they're going to be able to find them, because they're not going to be available. And so they're willing to accept substitutions of non-local genotypes, cultivars, in some cases even non-native species, because they don't see the availability out there in the short time frame that they typically need these seeds. The suppliers, on the other hand, and now the suppliers we're typically talking about private sector actors, seed producers, aren't making seeds available because they don't see strong, consistent demand. So it's a vicious cycle. Growers aren't growing as much as they could because buyers aren't buying as much as they could. And this seems like a problem that ought to be solvable, because as we found, there's a lot of latent demand out there, and there's a lot of latent supply capacity out there. And I think we all can agree on the committee that's what's needed is good old-fashioned public sector intervention to help the market function better, as the public sector often does in almost every sector of the economy you can think of. There is some sort of government intervention to make the market function better. And where we see the intervention being most effective is if the public sector buyers of seeds, such as BLM, would do more advanced planning, provide more consistent demand signals, be tighter about their policies of using native seeds and allowing fewer substitutions of other kinds of materials. That would be one huge way that the public sector could help stabilize and expand the whole market. The other thing the public sector could do is jump in the same way that the USDA programs have done for over a century with other forms of agriculture, which is to help seed growers, help the growers of seed for restoration in the same kinds of ways that they help corn farmers and tomato farmers and all other kinds of farmers. That's everything from developing better seed stock, to developing better kind of technical tools, to helping them meet the communication challenges between buyers and suppliers, and all sorts of ways that the public sector can just kind of tweak the market to help solve a collective problem that a lot of private seed suppliers face. And the result then will be a healthy, thriving private sector seed industry that will benefit everybody, public sector and private sector buyers of seeds for restoration. So if you're really busy and you need to take your cat to the vet or anything, you can leave now because I've just told you our punchline. But please don't though, because we have more interesting detail to go into. And I do want to kind of slow myself down here and let Beth jump in more, especially as we go into kind of more of the details of our findings and recommendations. So Beth, I will try to keep my promise to pause after every slide from here on out to let you jump in. Do you want to jump in now or should I continue?
Yeah, I mean, what you just said was perfect. That was,
Yeah.
Everyone can leave now. No, I'm just kidding. And in your introduction, I was thinking, Susan said that this wasn't necessarily her focus, her area of study. For me, restoration has been sort of an obsession, I would say, since I started working here at UNR. And this panel was so fantastic to have people from all over the US, which looking at the participants, again, this is a super broad group. And the panel was a super broad group. And so you saw like all of this need in the West and all of these different seed zones in the West, and to sort of have the great brains think about it at the US scale was super great. And the only thing I would add to your nutshell side, Susan, is we kind of, during our process, we saw a lot of examples of this really working at a small scale. Like at a small scale, people are communicating their needs, private growers are growing them, and they're going back out on the landscape. And probably a bunch of people have examples of that. And so what we're trying to do is take that communication and back and forth and make it a national scale. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All right, well, moving on, I just want to give a really brief overview of our study methodology and just some examples of our results. And you can read all 217 pages of our report if you want to know more detail. So this is just going to be the kind of the broad brush overview. But first of all, I think our biggest single source of information was just presentations from an incredible variety of people with incredible knowledge from every sector. Seed growers of various sorts, public sector folks from all sides, university folks, NGOs, many folks from NGOs, just really a brain trust of great presenters. It was really like, I mean, I think we should, if we were younger, we should all get master's degrees in seed supply for all the great courses, all the great lectures we attended on this subject. And if any of these folks are in the audience today, thank you very much. That was just an incredible immersion into the subject with a lot of divergent viewpoints too, which also made it really fun and made us understand some of the tensions better. So we had presentations. We also did formal surveys, and we wanted to do surveys of all sectors, but we found it was really only practical to do formal surveys for two sectors, which were seed suppliers, and then state level users of seeds. State level users tend to be either transportation departments or wildlife departments. Federal users are too diffuse, too heterogeneous. There isn't like a pool of them you can go to and survey. And we used structured interviews with key federal agency people instead of the formal surveys. Again, thanks to everyone, especially anyone here who filled out one of our pesky surveys. We are very grateful. So here's just some examples of our findings. So again, these state users are mostly either wildlife or transportation departments. Here's what their response was to the question of, do you use native seed for X purpose? So there's a lot of seed being used for wildlife and pollinator habitat creation, and for roadside revegetation, for stream erosion mitigation, and so forth. The kinds of uses you might expect. When state users were asked, do you care about using native versus non-native seed? Almost everybody said native, as you can see on the left here, and that was true in both West and Eastern US. We often disaggregated our question, or our respondents by Western versus Eastern US, because those are two kind of different meta ecosystems. A much lower but still substantial percentage of respondents care about the seeds coming from the quote right seed zone, a genetically appropriate criterion. And a smaller proportion, not a majority, care a lot about having the seed be certified. In other words, having it officially checked out to make sure that it is the species and the seed zone and labeled as such, so that the source can be definitively known. When we asked state users, do you sometimes substitute your preferred type of native seed for something lesser, like non-natives or cultivars? Most said yes. And then when they were asked why, by far the leading reason, as you see on the bottom of this graph, is that the preferred type of seeds were unavailable regardless of price and regardless of the amount of time it would take to generate the sale. So there's just an absolute level of unavailability. There's also many situations in which the preferred natives are not available in the time needed. That's the middle. And also a sizable number of cases in which the preferred natives, being these local genotypes, are just simply considered to be too expensive. They're much more expensive than cultivars, which are much easier to grow and can be sold over a much larger area.
Can I jump in on this one?
Yes. Oh yeah. Please. Shut up.
Wait, go back one.
Oh, yeah.
No. I just found this to be a profound result, because in my world, the dogma is always that natives are too expensive. Natives are too expensive. And that is not what state users are telling us. I mean, yes, a third of them are saying they're too expensive, but mostly they're saying, I simply cannot get them.
Just not there, yeah.
There's no amount of money that I can use to get them. And so this to me shouts opportunity, right? Because we're always hearing about
unmet demand.
Yeah, pent up demand. I think you're right.
That's right. Business opportunities for the right person. Just an example of some of the feedback that we got in our semi-structured interviews of federal users. Yes, there would be really nice to have a longer planning horizon. Unfortunately, many buyers are constrained by these weird ways that federal funding arrives in response to a disaster, and then with very strict limits on the time frame in which it can be spent, making it basically impossible to buy the appropriate seed for some need. You always have to be using seed that's been generated in the past and stored, because there's not going to be time to buy the seed that you actually need using the funding that you have. Everybody said we do not have enough botanists, ecologists, restoration trained people. We're making these decisions without the necessary expertise. And I think this last one is an understatement. There's some ambiguity about the definition of local. Like, even those who are committed to buying local seed aren't always sure what that means. On the supplier side, by far, as you can see, the temporal unpredictability of demand, the fact that there's a wildfire one year that generates huge demand and then no fire the next, et cetera, just makes it really hard for them to meet demand. They're always tracking a moving target. with their production. But as you can see, there's some other significant problems, like many native species are difficult to grow. It's not always easy to get the stock seed that you need from the wild, and a few other things. But certainly if we were able to address the first problem, unpredictability of demand, we would be helping a lot of suppliers, it seems. Suppliers were pretty optimistic that they could grow a lot more seed if they had a higher and more predictable demand. This is kind of the good news, goes back to that earlier point. The capacity is out there, and it's being underutilized because of the just because the market doesn't have enough brains to put the supply together with demand. There's this kind of market shortfall. This, I guess the economists would call it a partial market failure or something like that. But as Beth correctly pointed out, it also means there's a great opportunity. A few tweaks to the system could conceivably make a big difference. Okay, now here we get to the part where, Beth, you got to really jump in on each of these. But we have 10 recommendations, so we'll go through each of them. And the first one that people felt really passionately about, is some kind of federal coordinating structure, so that a lot of the overarching questions about how to do it right, what kind of policy, what are the best practice policies that everybody should be following, some of the basic kinds of information exchange and support and technical training could be coordinated at a national level, so you don't have 50 states doing 50 different things, trying to solve the same problem in 50 different ways. And it was argued that there's a nice precedent for this, which is the National Interagency Fire Center, which, just like restoration, it deals with a problem that roars across jurisdictional boundaries, and in which infrastructure, being able to kind of smoothly share infrastructure and knowledge across those boundaries, makes for much better responses. And as I'll tell you at the end, but I'll tell you now just in case I forget, the BLM, in response to our report, is going to hire a consultant to investigate the possibility for this center, to kind of look at structures and budgets and how it might work. So action is beginning on this recommendation. Beth, please jump in.
Yeah, as an example of how this coordination could help, I'm part of a Nevada Native Seed Partnership. That's state, federal, non-NGOs, tribes, universities. And we spend a lot of time talking about the first bullet, policies that prevent us as this, group of people who work on land from collecting or sharing seeds. If I collect under a research permit and I grow them up, can I then give them to a private grower to increase and then sell to the BLM, right? There are these issues that we keep running into at the scale of Nevada that are really national issues. And since this report, we've started talking about them with California, which is a neighbor, right? We share ecosystems and we share issues. So there is potential to clarify some of these policies that prevent just like the rational collection, growth, and deployment of seeds.
Right.
So I think it's a huge opportunity to just coordinate. And I have this vision of, just being able to cut through some of that red tape in order to get the right seed in the right place at the right time, irrespective of the initial permit or the person who collected. So I see a huge opportunity there. Similarly, infrastructure, we don't necessarily need to have every agency and every grower have the same seed cleaning equipment. There's an opportunity for perhaps, at the infrastructure level, some sharing among regions, which we already do, but to some extent. But it would be really a lot better if we could cut through some of these jurisdictional boundaries and just be more efficient. So that's just two examples.
Sort of analogous to when they figured out that all the law enforcement agencies were using different radio frequencies, right?
Right, exactly. Yes, just stop.
right, just stop. But then somebody up here has to say, just stop.
That's right.
Otherwise, it doesn't work.
That's
so,
right.
But moving on, at the same time, we're talking about this sort of federal coordinating role. We want to really acknowledge, and this is a really kind of exciting thing for me to learn about, that, and Beth alluded to this already, so much progress is being made at, kind of just below that scale, either statewide or multi-state consortia, or sometimes even regions within states have kind of consortia that are dedicated to solving these problems. Some of these partnerships have been started by the federal agencies. Others have kind of grown up more from the grassroots, but they do some of these, down closer to the ground functions that are very appropriately done when not only the general problems, but the actual species and ecosystems are shared, within some boundary, because then the different parties that need to deal with sagebrush or that need to deal with whatever kind of ecosystem you're talking about can do things like agree on what are the correct species to use, what are the good sources for that species, what are the seed zones for that species. And then, we would envision some kind of a scenario planning where these entities would get together and figure out what is the demand trajectory going to look like over the next 5 to 10 years, which will be really helpful for the suppliers. And they can develop all kinds of other more ecosystem specific practices too, how to deploy the seeds, how to monitor the restoration projects, and so on. So we see the need to really keep going in this direction. And one job for the federal entity that we just talked about would be to foster and sort of create some dialogue among these different regional partnerships, and to make sure that really every part of the country is covered by a regional partnership, because they seem to be very effective in the places that they have sprung up.
And one of the observations when we were gathering this information was that each region had maybe a different strength. So if you happen to be in a region that had a really well-established private botanic garden or seed bank, you did not have that need, right? But if you were in another part of the country that did not have that, the need for seed collection and stock seed would be like your primary goal. So each region kind of does each of these 4 things differently. Some regions have a huge agricultural component and they have that completely worked out, but maybe they, don't necessarily have their seed zones worked out. Anyway, it was, rather than a national partnership, regional seemed appropriate given the needs of certain parts of the.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's not just the shared ecosystems, but also some other regional characteristics that probably even just the history of restoration in that region. Yeah.
And land ownership differences and all of those things really.
Right. Moving on. We had a tribal representative on our committee, and part of our statement of task included considering the role of tribes in this whole picture. And we learned that there is a entity called the Intertribal Nursery Council, and it exists to foster the exact types of things we're talking about, to help tribes participate more as producers of seed, both for their own needs and potentially for other regional needs. We heard some nice examples of partnerships between tribes and adjacent federal land managers, for example, to involve the tribes in the production and use of native seed materials. So basically our recommendation here is keep doing that. We would like to see the federal government give more funding and backing to the Intertribal Nursery Council to do what it does.
Just echoing, I think that's super important. And I think tribes can really help focus on focal species and even geographic areas to be moving plants. It's just a supernatural partnership and lots of opportunity.
Okay, the first bullet point here under recommendation 4 really has hovered over us for the entire time that our committee met. Basically, the idea that perhaps the single biggest way to help the whole seed supply situation would be for the large federal land management agencies, and we're really looking at you, BLM, but others too, to plan and conduct restoration proactively on a large scale, instead of having these large but very short-term reactive wildfire-driven emergency needs, to be able to create some sort of funding scheme and policy direction that would target some number of acres, some number of hundreds of thousands of acres, we hope, of restoration per year. That would both be a much better way to do restoration in itself, because it'd be more planned and maybe people would actually come up with good restoration designs, but also because it would then create this big economic incentive for seed suppliers. So we really would like to see policies shifting toward making restoration. And we have some specific, toward the end of this, I think in the last recommendation, some specific ways we think that BLM could change itself a little bit organizationally to help make this possible. Going along with that, we want to see the agencies, and again, thinking a lot about BLM, but also about others, be real clear in their own organizational minds about when they want to see native seeds used. And if you want native seeds to be used, don't make it a squishy recommendation, make it a pretty strong requirement with possible exceptions. But right now in some agencies, it's more of a squishy recommendation, which means that it's getting ignored a lot of the time because it is cheaper and easier. And yeah, there are other reasons, but there are a lot of substitutions, and that really undermines the native seed market. So we're not in a position to tell agencies what their policies should be, but if they're going to have policies, then they should, get serious about how they implement those. And or if they already have a policy direction, they should align their actual policies with those around using native seeds rather than other things. We talked a lot about contracting mechanisms that can help alleviate the problem by reducing the risk for growers, creating greater flexibility, making the whole purchasing process smoother, getting around some of the red tape. The BLM uses the indefinite quantity, indefinite delivery, IDIQ contract mechanism, which is designed to sort of cut red tape. The Forest Service uses blanket purchase agreements. These are ways, and we encourage agencies to keep using and keep also developing new ways to alleviate some of the problems of just all the time that gets burned up by setting up purchasing agreements, essentially. And also the whole risk sharing aspect of it, that you can have contracts that pay people to produce the product, not just pay them for what they actually deliver. At least some mechanism by which growers get paid something for trying, because it's an inherently risky market. This is the kind of thing that the food agriculture sector has benefited from for a long time. So basically, some kind of a risk sharing system. And we also would really like to see the USDA take a harder look at the role of natives in its CRP, its crop resting conservation research program. It's like all I could think of was crop rotation program. I knew that, anyway, the big program that spends tens of millions of dollars a year to pay farmers to take their land out of production, to rest it for a while, to plant in some cases natives, but oftentimes non-natives, oftentimes cultivars. It's a complicated program, but we think that there's a lot of scope to strengthen the role of native seeds in that program, which would be a huge source of revenue for the growers of native seeds, as well as being ecologically beneficial for wildlife, pollinators, etc. Okay, so in that same vein, USDA does a lot of outreach and technical support and informational support to conventional agriculture. They develop new cultivars, they develop new kind of seed technologies, growing technologies. They provide informational resources to growers on what to grow where and how to grow it and what seed sources to use. Also, they, I think, provide a certain amount of sort of market type advice, how to find buyers, etc. All the kinds of informational and technical support that NRCS and other USDA programs provide to conventional farmers would be really helpful to native seed growers as well, especially the smaller growers. And we think that a really great way to diversify the seed supply that comes into restoration is to encourage a lot more small growers, and smaller growers are most likely to be handicapped by the lack of information, lack of technical tools, although large growers find those things to be limiting as well. So we'd really like to talk to USDA about how some of these programs could take native seed more under their wing.
I would just echo this. In Nevada, our state agriculture agency does a lot of this work, but we have been talking with the NRCS about how they can help us support suppliers. We don't have a very large, we have an extremely small native seed industry, despite using a ton of native seed, and getting people over those first few years, you know, the technical challenges is huge. And yes, all I can say is we'd love federal help.
Right. It's very, you know, very classic way that the government helps the private market work better. Especially in the case of an essential commodity, and we would argue that native seeds for restoration are an essential commodity. And this just, recommendation 6 just kind of continues and maybe broadens that theme. There are a ton of informational and research needs at all levels of this problem, starting with just kind of how to do restoration, especially in an era when we know that the climate is changing and putting back what was there before isn't a necessarily winning strategy. And there's lots of viewpoints and not a whole lot of evidence base, I would say, to go on right now. Maybe Beth will disagree, but I think that there's been a lot more talk than actual research on the success of different approaches to climate adapted restoration. That very much goes to the heart of seeds and what you should be planting here now that you hope will be persisting here 50 years into the future. How to tie restoration to, you know, the functional attributes of ecosystems that we want to bring back, how to better incorporate traditional ecological knowledge. Also, we had several economists on our committee, and they'd really, so this first line here is about the kind of research we'd like to see. For example, the National Science Foundation Fund, and the big, broad questions about how to do restoration better in so many ways. The second line here is more about the technical stuff. And if you think of all the hundreds and hundreds of species that are already, even currently, in the pipeline for restoration uses, let alone the hundreds more that there really ought to be, every one of them has its problems of, you know, where do you find it? How do you grow it? How do you germinate it? How do you clean it? How do you test it? How do you maintain its genetic integrity under cultivation? You know, there's a whole checklist of kind of just very technical problems that need to be solved for every species brought into cultivation. And so that's the kind of the technical research that either USDA or USGS, some of the more, you know, kind of applied research agencies ought to be doing more of, in our opinion. For everybody who does, for all the public sector, let's say, who does restoration, we'd like to see them truly embrace adaptive management, which is another one of those concepts that's honored a lot more in the name than in actuality. That's where you actually solve some of your future problems by using your present restoration to gain a little more information. So instead of just using the approach that you think is going to work best, you use that one plus a couple of others, maybe in one little corner of your restoration project, and you gain and retain and archive and make use of that information in your next restoration project. It's, you know, adaptive management is a brilliant concept, and in practice, people just don't often take the extra time and resources that it needs to gain important new information from their actions. And so we would hope that at least some of the bigger agencies could do a little bit more of this as they do actual restoration. And then a really kind of one single specific issue that where perhaps coordination and research is most needed is kind of getting everybody's thoughts together on seed zone delineation. That's a really important issue for seed suppliers, because different purchasers rather, may have different notions of how local seed needs to be. And there are different whole conceptual approaches and practical approaches towards seed zones. And if our hypothetical future federal program can guide a national system of seed zone delineation, it will really help solve a big problem in the supply chain.
So Susan, there are 2 questions that are about this slide. It's a little unconventional, but I feel like maybe we should talk about them on the slide.
Okay. These are questions that came up in the Q&A?
Yeah. So one, Ryan Lance, he says, the seed zone seems somewhat small. A smaller zone in which you can market seed will limit private interest in investing. Was this
right? Well, that's a tension that we heard about. You know, a purist wants a small seed zone, but a small seed zone is a real handicap for a seed supplier. We don't have any, as a committee, any opinion about how large or small seed zones should be, but this is why we think that there needs to be some kind of national committee of people to figure out seed zones, you know.
And one thing I can add that we talked about a little bit, and there's, you know, even if an area has 20 seed zones, when you look at the restoration needs, it's often 2 to 3 that need most of the work, you know. So
right.
Collaborators working on a paper that shows that across the cold deserts of the West, for every ecoregion, for these workhorse species, over 50% of the fires have been in just 2 seed zones.
I remember we heard that from one of our presenters too, that like,
yeah, exactly,
90% of the demand comes from 3 seed zones or something. Yeah,
that's right. So there are a lot of zones, and really what it's telling you is don't take things from high elevation, for example, and put it in low elevation if low elevation is time. So don't be like completely blinded by the number of zones.
Yeah, right. That's a good point.
Another question that's related to the first one, Carrie Simo, how many years do you think is appropriate for cultivation? Any guidance or trends on how long to keep species in cultivation before refreshing with fresh wild genetics? Yes, right? That's a question. And a really great paper just came out about this morning, which Susan was the handling editor for. And Anna Bukarova and her group in Germany did this great study where they followed, like, I don't know, 15, 16 species through the cultivation process for 5 generations, which is what they do in Germany. And they did see some species changed, but many did not. And interestingly, it was farm dependent. So some species changed a lot on one farm, but then didn't change on another farm, which sort of indicates that it is possible to sort of limit and reduce that kind of change that happens in cultivation. So
cool.
Just thought that's very timely.
I just noticed it's 9:48, so
yeah, sorry.
Power ahead. No, I haven't been following time as closely as I should. Yeah. It's really fun to do this in a more dialogue-y kind of way.
Yeah.
I wish we had a little bit more time, but anyhow,
I know, sorry.
You don't. Yeah, infrastructure, this is kind of a no-brainer. Clearly, when you have a kind of a supply chain that's under a lot of stress, creating more storage is a way to kind of loosen things up, to kind of make the chain function better. Unfortunately, seeds are little living beings, and they need to be stored in a very specialized way. It has to be cold, it has to be dry, and not only do they need to be stored in that way, but then when they're shipped to where they're going to be used, if they sit out in a truck in the hot sun for a day, they might all die. You know, millions of carefully produced seeds. So anyway, a big source of infrastructure need is more refrigerated warehouses deployed in more parts of the country to reduce those transportation needs. And these warehouses need to be managed by people that understand seeds and their biology and their temperature and moisture needs. And another related thing Beth already mentioned is seed cleaning, especially for smaller growers. Having the technical tools available to extract all these little tiny seeds from all the junk that comes with them when they're collected from the wild represents a type of infrastructure that, if it were shared cooperatively, rather than everyone having to have their own, could really help many small growers get off the ground. So either of all the infrastructure needs, these ones kind of jumped out as the ones where a nationwide system supported by the federal government could really be a cost-effective way to help the private sector, essentially. And then I'm going to move now into our last 3 recommendations, which are all specifically aimed at BLM, the sponsor of our study. We wanted to make sure that they knew what we thought they should do. And so this first one is going to sound a lot like recommendation 7, but that's because we wanted to give very specific guidance to BLM. They do have, I believe, 3 seed warehouses, one of which isn't functioning right now. And we really want to see them have more and to have them be better distributed. We want to see them managed as a national resource, not just by like a state office of BLM, because ideally this should be a resource that even non-BLM seed users could potentially make use of. And of course, they have to be run properly. And another thing we heard, I'm going to mention quickly, the things that I heard from Peggy Olwell, is that they've already put in a funding request to expand their warehouse system. So I hope this is a case of us telling them something to do that they already wanted to do, and we gave them that guidance because it's a critical need. It was pointed out to us multiple times by many people that the ultimate source of storage of seed for restoration purposes is nature, that natural lands that still have intact native plant communities represent a far larger seed bank than anything humans could ever build. And so agencies like BLM that are concerned about restoration and the seed supply for restoration should be taking that into account when they manage their natural lands. And we think that there's scope for kind of surveying this problem geographically and maybe placing some protective designations on certain areas of land that are prime sources of seed, at least including the potential to be an important seed source on the kind of the list of things for which multiple use lands are managed, not have it be ignored when land use decisions are being made. So this one, I think, caused a little bit of a stir, raised some eyebrows, which is good. We're happy about that.
Yeah, and this was actually one of my favorite recommendations.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most radical things we can do for climate change is gather what we have, study the trait environment relationships, study the genetic history, and put it in a seed bank. You know, 100 years from now, you cannot go backwards and get this information, and you cannot go backwards and get these populations. So I think this is a really great suggestion.
Yeah, and it's just so, and on the flip side, it's just so sad to think of, like, here's all these people trying to figure out how to generate more seed supply for restoration, and the other part of their agency is, you know, doing terrible things to the lands that the seed comes from. So so hopefully this just raises awareness that certain places are more important than others for providing that seed resource. And then finally, this one I think was particularly near and dear to my heart. We heard some great presentations from members of a couple of different nonprofit organizations that were really dedicated to this whole problem and to improving restoration on public lands, particularly in the West, and particularly BLM lands. And they pointed out, and others pointed out to us too, that BLM has been structurally a little bit handicapped in its ability to deal with these problems because organizationally it's divided into activities and sub-activities, and those units have budgets, and they have directors, and they have funding requests, and they have systems of accountability for monitoring how that funding is spent. And although there is a plant conservation and restoration program, it is not an activity or a sub-activity. So it doesn't have that kind of authority or accountability, ability to kind of set its own plans and then hire the personnel it needs and monitor how well its benchmark targets are being met, ask for the funding it needs. Instead, restoration always ends up being the last step in some other process run by some sub-activity. So oil and gas management, burrow management, and wild horse management, you know, go down the list. Each one of those kind of calls in restoration as the last step in some other thing that they're doing. And as long as you have that situation, you're not going to have this kind of ability to plan and be proactive and promulgate kind of best practices. So, so we would like to see a sort of a structural change so that plant conservation restoration is elevated to the level of that higher level at which it can have more authority. And hearteningly, we heard again from Peggy Olwell that proposed change is being put forward. Now, not to say it will happen, but it has been officially proposed, and a kind of the bureaucratic process to make it a sub-activity has been initiated. So I will just quickly, here's our summary. I guess I better, just for the sake of time, our last 5 minutes, I will not read you this list of bullet points. Those are the 10 recommendations that I just told you about. Those are all in the service of this kind of overview recommendation that I told you about, kind of starting the virtuous cycle of federal support that helps a robust seed industry that benefits both public and private suppliers and users. And these are just quickly the things that Peggy told us are already underway. An internal proposal to create a new warehouse and to enhance the capacity for proactive restoration. Consultant to look at the proposal for a national center and study its feasibility. And this proposal for a separate sub-activity for plant conservation and restoration. We feel that this our work happened at a really fortuitous time because there have been all these big spending bills in the last couple of years that have shunted some serious amounts of money to the land management agencies. And we hope that our report arrived just in time to channel some of those funds toward this problem. So I will shut up now. Thank you very much. And Beth, please chime in or put out some questions that you've read if we still have time for that.
Yes, Maura, maybe you can give us guidance. I'm trying to answer the questions in the Q&A, which are great.
Oh, go ahead. We have a few minutes.
Okay.
Oh, good, okay.
Let's see. One question that I think is great is, aren't technical knowledge and adaptive lessons trade secrets? How do you get private entities to share information with new growers?
Huh.
And I was just answering
Well,
that was a great place for the NRCS, for example, to step in and help small growers, because yes, right, it is a challenge to get a large grower to help a small grower, but that is again somewhere where the federal government could step in and help.
Right. Yeah, I don't think we could expect private entities to help each other. It's more encouraging that the federal government to help everybody, but with a special emphasis on helping the small players. And yeah, as you say, I mean, the way that the NRCS and other USDA programs have operated in the past is a good model for that. Or I should say it's a model, because I don't know how good it is, but it would be the model, yeah.
There's a question about the survey, about when we asked people about using substitutions, let's see, did you ask users about their use of species substitutions? Like, why did they do it? Not substituting with cultivars, but with another locally collected ecotype.
I don't think so. I think if I understand the question right, I think we dealt with those broad categories of native species, local ecotype, native species, not local ecotype, and then also the native species that is both local ecotype and source identified. So we dealt with those categories. We didn't really talk that much about either species themselves or species diversity as a goal in restoration, which I think we should have. We just didn't get there.
Yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
And one last question, which is also something a practitioner asked me: should we be focusing on these really dominant workhorse species, or should we be focusing on sort of a more nuanced niche species for diversity in restoration?
Yes.
That's exactly what I said.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely it takes a multi-pronged approach. And besides, and I think some of our recommendations go more to the workhorse species. Some of them go more to how do you get the species, diversity in the mix. But one that is near to my heart is also the research to find out, assuming that ecosystem function is one of the goals of restoration, what is the relationship between species diversity and composition and kind of short and long-term ecological outcomes? And that's where I would love to see, say, National Science Foundation have a targeted competition for proposals in that area. We've had too much biodiversity and ecosystem functioning research has taken place on 1 square meter plots.
Exactly.
And too little of it has scaled up to the scale of real restoration projects, which is where it's needed.
Yeah.
But I just want to thank you both so much. It's the second time I've heard the study. It's always interesting, certainly an important thing that we need to solve, important area that needs to be resolved for our work. So thank you so much for all that you've done to contribute to it, all that you did to share it today. And we look forward to hearing more results, more reactions, more progress. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
All right, take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.